They thought I had nothing left. That's what my son told his mother the night before the hearing. I wasn't supposed to hear it. I was sitting in the dark at the kitchen table, the way old men do when sleep stops coming easy, and their voices carried down from upstairs like they always did in that house. That old colonial with the thin floors I'd been meaning to fix for 30 years. My son said, "He's got nothing, Mom. He doesn't even know what he signed." And my wife laughed. I sat there with my hands flat on the table, and I didn't move. I just let it settle into me, the way cold settles into your bones when you've been outside too long. I was 64 years old. I had spent 41 of those years building something, and the two people I had built it for were upstairs laughing at me in the dark. I want to tell you how I got to that kitchen table, because nothing about that night makes sense unless you understand where it started. I grew up in Scranton, Pennsylvania, the son of a man who fixed boilers for a living. We didn't have money. We had work ethic, which my father treated like it was the same thing. I put myself through 2 years of community college, transferred to Penn State on a partial scholarship, and by the time I was 26, I had a small electrical contracting business running out of the back of a pickup truck. By the time I was 40, I had 42 employees, contracts with 3 hospital systems, and a company worth, conservatively, $8 million. I'm not telling you this to brag. I'm telling you because you need to understand what was at stake, and because you need to understand the kind of man I was, the kind who worked 16-hour days and trusted the people around him completely, because that's what you do when you love someone. You trust them. You don't check. I met my wife at a church potluck in 1987. She was 23. I was 25. She had this way of tilting her head when she listened to you that made you feel like you were the most important person in the room. We were married 11 months later. For the first 20 years, I thought we had a good marriage. Looking back, I think I was confusing quiet with good. She didn't fight with me. She didn't complain. She ran the house, raised our son, showed up to company dinners, and smiled at all the right moments. I thought that was contentment. I understand now it was management. She was managing me the way you manage an asset. Carefully, patiently, without letting the asset know it's being managed. Our son was born in 1991. I coached his Little League team. I drove 4 hours each way to watch him play college football. When he graduated from Penn State, my alma mater, I cried in the parking lot where he couldn't see me. I was so proud of that boy. He came to work for the company in 2016. That was my idea. I wanted to pass something down. I wanted him to have what I never had, a foundation, a start. What I didn't know was that by 2016, my wife had been seeing someone else for 6 years. His name was Theodore. He was a real estate developer, divorced, mid-50s, the kind of man who wore linen shirts in October and called his sports car she. My wife had met him at a charity gala I hadn't attended because I had a crew dealing with a transformer failure at St. Luke's Hospital. I was always somewhere dealing with something. She had been dealing with Theodore. I found out the way you always find out, by accident. February of 2019. I came home early because my back had been giving me trouble and I just wanted to sit in my own chair. Her car was in the driveway. So was a silver Mercedes I didn't recognize. I won't go into the details of what I found. Some things a man doesn't need to put into words. I'll only say that I stood at the bottom of my own staircase for a long time before I walked back out to my truck and drove to a diner on Route 6 and sat there until midnight drinking coffee I didn't taste. Here is where I made the decision that changed everything. I did not confront her that night. I thought about it. Lord knows I thought about it, but somewhere between my third cup of coffee and the sound of the rain on the diner windows, something settled in me. A coldness, not anger. I'd had anger, and it had burned through me like fuel. What was left underneath was something quieter, something that understood that this was not a moment for emotion. This was a moment for patience. I drove home. She was in bed. I slid in beside her and stared at the ceiling and started to plan. The first thing I did, the very next morning, was call an attorney. Not a divorce attorney. A forensic accountant first, and then an attorney. I told my attorney that I believed my wife had been engaged in a long-term extramarital relationship, and that I wanted to understand, completely and thoroughly, my financial exposure before I made any move whatsoever. That meeting changed the course of everything that followed, because what my attorney told me, and what the accountant confirmed over the next 4 months, was that my wife had not been idle during those 6 years. She had been, quietly and methodically, moving money. It started small, wire transfers to a joint account I barely checked, then to an account I didn't know existed. Expense reimbursements from my own company. She was technically listed as a consultant, a formality I'd set up years ago for tax purposes, that had grown from a few $1,000s a year to, in 2018 alone, over $240,000. She'd been running it through Theodore's Real Estate LLC, which held properties in her name that I didn't know existed, and my son had helped her. That was the part that took the breath out of me when the accountant laid it on the desk. My son, who I had brought into the company to give him a future, had been signing off on the reimbursements. He had access to the accounts. He had been doing it for at least 2 years. I sat in that attorney's office and I didn't speak for a long time. The accountant was a careful woman named, well, it doesn't matter what her name was. She just slid the papers across to me one at a time, the way you'd feed bad news to someone slowly, and I took each one and I read it and I set it down. When I finally spoke, I said, "How much total?" She said, "Our best estimate is between $800,000 and $1.2 million over 6 years. I nodded. I folded my hands. I said, "What do I do now?" And that's when the real planning began. I want to be honest with you. The next 14 months were the hardest of my life. I went home every night to a woman I knew was betraying me. I ate dinner across the table from her. I watched football with my son on Sundays. I said good morning and good night, and I smiled when it was appropriate, and I held all of it inside me like water behind a dam. There were moments, and I'm not ashamed to admit this, when I nearly broke. There was a Sunday in April when my son put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You look tired, Dad. You should slow down." And I had to look away because the kindness in his voice, the performance of it, nearly undid me. But I kept going, because I had understood something important. The moment I revealed what I knew, the money would disappear. Theodore would move it. My wife would lawyer it up within the hour. My son would play dumb. Whatever I had would be their word against mine. And they had a 2-year head start, so I waited, and I documented. My attorney filed quietly with the court to preserve certain financial records. We worked with the accountant to build a paper trail that was airtight. I had the home office, which I still technically owned outright, wired with a small recording device, nothing intrusive, just a camera in the corner that nobody noticed because it had been sitting on the shelf in the same spot for 11 years. I had it looked at, repaired, repositioned slightly. It recorded 62 hours of conversation over 4 months. I will not tell you everything that was on those recordings, but I will tell you that on March 14th of last year, my wife sat in my home office with Theodore and my son, and they discussed, clearly and specifically, how they intended to use a power of attorney document I had signed in 2017. Signed because I was having back surgery, and my attorney had recommended it as a precaution to begin transferring the business assets into a trust that would effectively remove me from my own company. My wife said on that recording, "By the time he figures it out, there won't be anything to figure out." My son said nothing. He just nodded. I listened to that recording 3 times in my attorney's office. On the 3rd time, I felt something release in me. Not grief. Something more final than grief. It was the last piece. We had everything we needed. My attorney filed for divorce 2 weeks later. And simultaneously, and this is the part I want you to understand, he filed a civil fraud complaint with documentation so complete that the judge issued a temporary asset freeze before my wife's attorney had even been retained. That's when they stopped laughing. Or, I should say, that's when they started laughing at me in a different way. Because when they finally understood what was happening, they shifted their strategy. They began portraying me as a confused old man. My son filed a declaration with the court stating that he had concerns about my cognitive clarity. My wife's attorney submitted documentation suggesting I had been making erratic financial decisions. The hearing was set for a Thursday in October. I showed up in gray slacks and a flannel shirt. No tie. No attorney beside me at the table, though my attorney was present in the room. I had decided, and this was deliberate, to look exactly like what they wanted the judge to see. An old man out of his depth. My wife came in with Theodore and my son. She was wearing a cream blazer. Theodore was in a suit that probably cost more than my first truck. My son wouldn't look at me. They sat on the other side of the room, and my wife leaned over and said something to her attorney, and her attorney smiled. And then my son looked at me, just once, and there was something in his face that I can only describe as pity. Not real pity. The kind of pity that's actually satisfaction wearing a disguise. The judge entered. The Honorable Sandra Whitmore, who had been on the family court bench in our county for 19 years. My wife's attorney opened by presenting the power of attorney. He argued that decisions made under that document were legally valid and that my attempts to reverse them were, in effect, a breach of the agreements I myself had authorized. He presented the declaration from my son about my cognitive state. He was smooth. He was confident. He laid it out like a man who believed he'd already won. When he finished, the judge looked at me. She said, "Mr." And she said my name. "Do you have a response?" I said, "Your Honor, I'd like to refer you to the envelope I submitted to your chambers 3 weeks ago." She looked at her clerk. The clerk produced it. It was a standard legal envelope, sealed with my name and a case number in the corner. She opened it. She began to read, and the room changed. I had included, in that envelope, a summary prepared by my attorney, but written in plain language, in my own words, organized chronologically, of every transfer, every recording, every document, every date. I had included a letter from the forensic accountant. I had included 2 pages of transcribed audio from the home office recording, just 2 pages, the most relevant 2 minutes. The judge read for 4 minutes. The room was completely quiet. My wife shifted in her seat. I saw it without looking directly at her. I was watching the judge's face. Theodore uncrossed and recrossed his legs. My son was very still. When the judge finished reading, she set the envelope down on the bench, and she looked at my wife's attorney. And she said in a voice that was perfectly level, "Counsel, before we go any further, I'm going to need you to explain to me why this court was not made aware of these financial instruments at the time of initial filing." My wife's attorney said, "Your Honor, I'm not certain what," the judge said. "The envelope, counsel." And that was the beginning of the end. I won't take you through every hour of what followed, because some of it was procedural, and I don't want to put you to sleep. What I will tell you is this. The asset freeze was made permanent, pending a full forensic audit. The power of attorney document was referred to the district attorney's office, along with the audio recordings, on the question of whether my son's involvement constituted financial elder abuse, which, under Pennsylvania law, it did. My wife and Theodore faced separate civil exposure on the fraud complaint. By February, the audit was complete. The total confirmed figure was $1.1 million. By April, the divorce was finalized. Under Pennsylvania equitable distribution law, the court treated the documented fraud as a factor in the settlement. My wife received significantly less than she would have under a standard split. Theodore's LLC had liens placed on 3 of the properties that had been funded with my money. My son, and this is the part that still sits heavy in me, even now, my son accepted a plea agreement. He cooperated with the DA's investigation in exchange for a reduced charge. He did not go to prison. He received 5 years of probation and was ordered to make restitution. He called me in May. He left a voicemail. He said he was sorry. I listened to it twice and I didn't call back. I don't say that with pride. I say it because it's true. Maybe someday I will. But a man who has been through what I have been through is allowed to take his time. Here is what I want you to know if you stayed with me this long. I am 64 years old. I rebuilt a business from a pickup truck and 40 years of early mornings. I was betrayed by the 2 people closest to me, and for 14 months I carried that alone because I understood that patience was the only tool I had that they couldn't take from me. They thought the silence was weakness. They thought the flannel shirt was confusion. They thought a tired old man showing up without a tie meant he had nothing. They were wrong about every single thing. The company is still mine. I have a small apartment now, on the 3rd floor of a building in downtown Scranton, 6 blocks from where my father used to drop me off at school. It's nothing like the house, but I make my own coffee in the morning and I sit by the window and nobody laughs at me in the dark. That's not nothing. That's everything. People ask me sometimes, people who hear this story, they say, how did you hold it together for 14 months? And I never know quite how to answer that, because the honest answer isn't dramatic. It isn't some great act of willpower. The honest answer is that I just kept making one small decision at a time. Go home, be quiet, write it down, come back tomorrow and do it again. That's not heroism. That's just what you do when you understand that you're in a game where losing your temper means losing everything. What I learned, what this whole experience burned into me, is that intelligence without patience is just noise. I'm not a brilliant man. I never was. I built my company on showing up and doing the work, not on being the smartest person in the room. But for 14 months, I was the most patient person in the room, and in the end, that mattered more than anything else. Theodore was smart. My wife was strategic. My son had access to things I had given him freely, out of love. They had every advantage. What they didn't have was time. They thought they were racing to take something from me. They didn't realize I had already decided to let them run, and that every step they took was leaving tracks. That's the thing about people who act without conscience. They move fast because they have to. They can't afford to slow down and think, because if they slow down, they might have to feel what they're doing. They might have to look at an old man across a dinner table and reckon with what they're taking from him. So they keep moving. And moving fast makes you sloppy. And sloppy people leave paper trails. I think about my son the most. Not with bitterness, or at least I'm trying to get there. I think about the boy who used to fall asleep in the truck on the way back from fishing, and I think about the man who nodded when his mother said my name like it was a problem to be solved. And I understand that what happened to him is what happens when a person lets someone else do their thinking for them. He didn't start out wanting to hurt me. He started out wanting to please her. And then, one small compromise at a time, he walked himself so far out onto the ice that by the time it started to crack, he didn't know how to walk back. That's not an excuse. It's just what I believe happened. And understanding it doesn't mean I owe him a phone call back right now. It just means I don't have to carry hatred on top of everything else. What I want to say, to anyone who's sitting right now in a situation that feels impossible, where the people around you have more resources and more confidence and they're moving fast while you're standing still, is this: Stillness is not the same as surrender. There is a kind of quiet that is actually the most dangerous thing in the room. The people who underestimated me did so because they confused my silence with confusion. They thought I didn't understand what was happening. I understood everything. I just chose when to speak. That apartment in Scranton with the morning light coming through the window, I earned that. Not by winning some dramatic courtroom moment, though that happened too. I earned it by deciding in a diner on Route 6 at midnight with a cup of cold coffee that I was not going to let grief make my decisions for me. That's the only wisdom I have to offer. Feel what you feel, and then set it aside long enough to think clearly. The rest tends to follow.